Hello, and welcome to episode 11 of my Stuarts vlog. And having now finished the political story of the Stuarts era, we're going to start looking at the religion theme. And the plan is to look in successive vlogs at the Catholic, Anglican, and nonconformist issues. But today I want to kind of do just a quick overview of the different types of Christianity that we meet and what their similarities and differences are and why that's important. So, if we start with the Catholic Church, I remember that until about 100 years before the Stuarts, the Catholic Church was the only church in Western Europe. And it was only really around the time of the printing press in the early 1500s that people began to read the Bible in their own languages and began to protest against the Catholic Church. And that, of course, it's not the only reason, but that led to the Protestant movement in Central Europe. So the Catholic Church was, and of course the Protestant movement then was embraced slightly reluctantly in England by Henry VIII, mostly in order to get his divorce from Catherine of Aragon in order to allow him to marry Anne Boleyn. That's important. I'll come back to that in a minute. So just starting with the Catholic Church, we're going to look at two things with each of the the Catholics and Anglicans, and then a little bit of the nonconformists. The first thing about kind of how they're organised. So the Catholic Church, things to remember is that the Pope is in charge. He is the Bishop of Rome, but he's the head of the Catholic Church. And that means that for Catholics, it's perceived at least that their loyalty is primarily to the Pope, to this chap in Rome, the head of the Catholic Church. And that means there's suspicion about Catholics and how loyal they are to the king or queen and to their country. So that is firstly an issue and why Catholics are feared. Secondly, there's a very hierarchical structure. Now, this is really good for keeping control of what people think and can say in your society. And that's, as we'll see, kind of replicated in the Anglican Church. And then the third thing is just to talk a little bit about some of the beliefs that the Catholics have, which are important here. So the first of those is the way in which Catholics felt that you could experience God through a wide range of inputs. A visit to a Catholic church was not just about kind of hearing stuff. It was also about hearing stuff, but not just about hearing words. You might hear music. You would see the stained glass window and the colours on the painted walls. You might appreciate the art and the statues that were made. And so there's kind of a sensual, and you might smell the incense that was used in the service too. So it's kind of a sensual experiencing of God, which was later kind of in the Reformation was frowned upon by the Protestant churches. Also, in the Catholic Church, the priest is seen as being kind of separate and special in different ways. He has a separate robe, which he wears. He is kind of kept a little bit apart from the congregation. There's a rail around the altar. And when he serves communion, when it says Mass, the communion, as the Anglicans call it, the bread and wine, there's this belief in Catholicism that it actually changes into Jesus inside of you. It's called transubstantiation. And of course, this is an idea which later on the Protestants see as being completely unbiblical. So there are these particular ideas that the Catholic Church have. Now, when the Protestant movement grew up in the early 1500s, it began out of the printing press developing and people beginning to read their Bibles and say, well, hang on a minute, it doesn't say anything in here about transubstantiation. How come they think that the bread and the wine turn into Jesus? At that point, they began to protest against the Catholic Church, and they all agreed that the Catholic Church had changed things and not for the better. And they said, what we need to do is to get back to the Bible. So the one thing that glues all the Protestant half of Christianity together is this belief, in theory, that everything should come from the Bible. All your theology, all your ideas should come from the Bible, whereas the Catholics see the Pope as kind of a fount of knowledge too. or church tradition, as they would say. So the Anglican Church was the English kind of Protestant effort, and this arose, as we know, out of Henry VIII needing a divorce from Catherine of Aragon so he could marry Anne Boleyn. Because of that, Henry wasn't really upset with the Catholic Church. He was kind of using the Protestant Reformation to get what he wanted. And so the Church of England, as it was set up, was kind of a compromise, really, between the church that Henry agreed with on most things and the church that he wanted to have on other things. So right from the very beginning, it's a sort of uncomfortable mishmash between the two. Now that over time settles down a bit, and if you've looked at Elizabeth at GCSE, you'll know that something called the Elizabethan settlement grows up, and that's very much a compromise between the two halves. So what you get is a church structure which is pretty similar to the Catholic Church. There's the Archbishop of Canterbury at the top, and above him the king or queen when Elizabeth was reigning. And then down, you've got the bishops and the local priests. Now, so again, you've got that kind of control element where the government could speak out through the churches and tell people what was happening and what they should think about it and how they should behave. That's very, very useful for the governments at this time. And one of the reasons, of course, that religion is criticised later on by other people in history. In terms of ideas, the ideas and theology of the Anglican Church is kind of, you could interpret it a number of ways. So they still had these, they had the Holy Communion, but they'd written it in such a way that you maybe could believe that it changed into Jesus inside you, but you didn't have to believe that. And that was a kind of an uncomfortable compromise. Now, that's really under pressure in the time that we are learning about. And within the church, you have those people who really want to finish the job and get rid of all the remnants of Catholicism. They want to purify the Church of England, and they're called the Puritans, obviously. And at the other extreme, you have people, the Arminians, who have come across through Charles I, who think that actually we've gone too far already, and there were good things the Catholics were doing that we could have kept, and particularly they liked the kind of art and sensual element of the way that Catholics worshipped. So you really only hear about this up to 1649, but you've got this conflict between the Puritans, who want to push on and reform the Church of England and just purify it up, and the Arminians, who they don't want to take it back to Catholicism, but they kind of want to keep the things that the Catholics had that they felt worked, while ditching the things that they felt were corrupt and wrong. So that's all I have to say about the Anglicans. Now, beyond them, you have then a whole range of Protestant groups. The Protestants were really good at agreeing what they protested against, but as so often in history, less clear on what they wanted to do about it. And I would say then you get, therefore, a range of groups that spring up, and you can kind of see them as on a scale out from the Anglicans. So beyond the Anglicans, I'd say you've got kind of the Presbyterians. The Scots were all Presbyterians, probably all-ish. And there's a big bunch of English Presbyterians too. These are people who wanted a structured church, but didn't like the idea of bishops. They didn't like the idea of there being a sort of God-ordained hierarchy in the church that went up that far. They often talk about Baptists at this time. These are people who felt they had a similar sort of structure, but they wanted to have adults be baptized rather than children, because they felt adults should pick to follow God rather than children being kind of assumed to follow God. They're not quite so prominent here. The next kind of phase of groups out are the Congregationalists, as I like to call them, or sometimes referred to as the Independents. Now, these a group of Christians felt that there shouldn't be a national structure at all, and so their local church was kind of a democratic unit. So their congregation, their church audience, if you like, would vote together to pick who was going to lead their church, and they would be accountable. That person would be accountable to them. There was no structure above that, so they were literally an independent congregation. That's why they're called Congregationalists or Independents. Now, the important thing there, of course, is that particular church is very difficult to control because there's nothing above it. And so that becomes more of a concern for the government when groups like this are springing up. Further out again than them are the Quakers, who are our kind of easy go-to radical group. I think partly because they've survived, really. But the Quakers believed that God could speak to any individual. And so in their meetings, there was no leader at all. And in fact, everybody kind of kept quiet until you felt that God was speaking to you. And then you would chip in with a song or something that you felt God had told you, or you wanted to read something from the Bible, to the crazy extent that even women could contribute in their meetings. Now, that is completely uncontrollable, even by the people that are in the meeting. And to a society where control was really important and there were limited ways in which you could keep a grip on how people behaved, it was felt as being really risky and radical and subversive to have groups like the Quakers saying, wow, God could speak to any of us and tell us anything and adapt things around. And very innovative is a word that they use in a bad way. So the Quakers are kind of right out there on the organisational fringe, I guess. And the other group I just want to mention quickly in finishing are the Fifth Monarchists. Now, you'll come across these a few times. The Fifth Monarchists are called Fifth Monarchists because of some prophecy towards the end of the New Testament, where they believed essentially that Jesus was coming back at the end of history to physically rule on earth, and that it was their job to tidy up and get ready for him. And so there's a famous incident called Venice Rising in 1661, where they rise up, 50 of them rise up in order to seize London to make it ready for Jesus. Now, these people, of course, are seen as being an even bigger risk and problem and threat to the stability of society because of the way in which they are threatening public order. Actually, just finally, the other group we mentioned are the Ranters. And the Ranters are a group that are so extreme that there has been debate about whether people made them up, that they're kind of a figment of the imagination. The Ranters were people, I guess if they did exist, just beyond the Quakers, who not only thought that God could speak to each of them individually, but he had spoken to each of them individually, and he'd say, go ahead and do crazy, outrageous and immoral and illegal things. And the propaganda that we have from this era says, look, see what happens when you let people have these religious freedoms and when there's no control of them. So I hope that gives you some idea both why nonconformity became a bit more attractive, but also why it was seen as being a threat and a destabilising influence, and why at the start of this, why Catholicism was feared and seen as being a bit suspicious. And then in the middle, the other part of the story we're going to have to look at is why it is that the Anglican Church struggles during this period, but then also to the extent to which it comes back in the Restoration. I hope that's helpful. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time when we'll talk about the Anglican Church.